Hey guys, today I'm going to update my comparison between Lumafusion and Final Cut Pro for iPad. When Apple first dropped Final Cut Pro for iPad a little over a year ago, I did a side-by-side comparison of these two apps, and at the time, I do think that Lumafusion had a bit of an edge, but Final Cut Pro for iPad has gotten a lot of updates in the past year, so I think it's time for a fresh look to see which is the right app for you. All right guys, let's just dive right in. First and foremost, you need to know about the device requirements. Lumafusion has a lot more flexibility when it comes to the devices that you can run it on. So unless you have a newer, more powerful iPad, you may have to use Lumafusion. But as people's devices reach end of life and they start upgrading their technology, I think a lot more people are going to be able to adopt Final Cut Pro for iPad. Now let's talk about price. Lumafusion is a one-time fee of $29.99. But there's a couple catches to that. If you want to do multicam editing, and if you don't know what that is, we're going to get to it, that's an extra $19.99. And if you want to be able to export your Lumafusion projects to an XML file for Final Cut Pro, that is an additional cost as well. On the other hand, Final Cut Pro for iPad is a subscription. We hate that. It's $4.99 a month, $49 for the whole year. But that does include multicam editing and exporting to Final Cut Pro. So it would seem at first blush that when it comes to price, Lumafusion is the clear winner, but I have some thoughts about that we're going to talk about at the end. Now let's talk about media management. This is an area where Final Cut Pro for iPad has made a huge leap in the last year. You can now edit from an external hard drive on both of these apps, whereas when Final Cut Pro for iPad first launched, you couldn't edit from an external drive and you had to import all of your media to live on your iPad. So now on both of these apps, you can edit from an external drive like this one. Total game changer. So in this area, it's a tie. Now let's talk about project settings like your aspect ratios, frame rates, and resolutions. In Final Cut Pro for iPad, you have preset aspect ratios for landscape and portrait. But if you click on resolution, you can actually enter in custom dimensions. For color space, you have HDR and SDR options, and all of the basic frame rate settings. In Lumafusion, you have many preset aspect ratios and a few more frame rates than you get in Final Cut Pro for iPad. And there's also a few more color space options as well. Now let's talk about the UI on each of these apps. Lumafusion has multiple layout options that you can switch between by hitting this button here. Final Cut Pro for iPad only has one layout, but you can resize these windows. And it also has this jog wheel to help you navigate around your timeline. I love this feature. You've heard me talk about this. And another big differentiator between these two is that in Final Cut Pro for iPad, you can do pretty much any task in this main screen, like color correcting or resizing your clips or adding other effects, as opposed to Lumafusion, where every time you want to make a change to a clip, it opens another window. And I personally do not like this. So overall, when it comes to UI, I personally prefer Final Cut Pro for iPad. I like the layout better, I like the colors better, and I like the functionality better. That's pretty subjective, but this is my video, so I'm going to declare Final Cut Pro for iPad the winner on UI. Now let's talk about basic editing. They pretty much both work the same. They both have a browser window where you can select your media, and they both have a magnetic timeline. You can keyframe on both of these, and you can expand all of your audio channels on both of these apps. You can also record voiceovers right into your timeline. That's something Lumafusion's had for a while, and Final Cut Pro got in the last year. Let's talk about audio editing in both of these apps. Like I said, you can expand the audio channels on your clips in both of them, but they both each come with a lot of different audio filters. And if you take a side-by-side look at them, they're pretty similar. But I do think Final Cut Pro for iPad does have some advantages. First and foremost, it has voice isolation, which uses machine learning to isolate people's voices in your clips. So it really does a great job of removing background noise, and that's something that is also available on the Mac app of Final Cut Pro. It also has this loudness option, which boosts the levels of your clips in a uniform way if the levels are kind of low. And it also has this noise removal feature. For me, these very essential tools are what you really need for audio editing, and Final Cut Pro for iPad definitely blows Lumafusion out of the water here, with the exception of Lumafusion's sound isolation feature, which does help reduce background noise. But overall, Final Cut has the edge. Now let's talk about the big one, multicam editing. If you don't know what multicam editing is, it's when you have two cameras set up on your shoot and you're recording simultaneously on them, and then you bring in that media into your editing app and you can switch between those angles seamlessly as if you're in a control room. Multicam editing is super popular. Like I said, if you want to do multicam editing on Lumafusion, it's an additional cost, whereas multicam is included in your Final Cut Pro for iPad subscription. Plus, they've taken it a huge step forward with a new feature just dropped called Live Multicam. Live Multicam allows you to connect up to 4 Apple mobile devices right into your Final Cut Pro for iPad app. And you can control all 4 of these camera angles right from the iPad. And Final Cut Pro for iPad will automatically generate the multicam clips for you so you can do your multicam edit. This is such an innovative take on multicam editing, and it made a huge splash when it was announced at the Apple event. If you want to know how to use Live Multicam in Final Cut Pro for iPad, I have a whole tutorial about that I'll link to down below. If you're going to go the Lumafusion route, I also have a tutorial on multicam editing there. Also, it will be linked down below. Now let's talk about color correcting in both of these apps. They each have slider-based color correction tools and color looks that you can apply to your clips. However, Lumafusion also comes with a bunch of LUTs you can apply to log footage, and you can even import your own LUTs, whereas Final Cut Pro for iPad does come pre-programmed with a bunch of camera LUTs. However, you cannot import your own. And one other advantage Lumafusion has over Final Cut Pro is scopes. In Final Cut Pro for iPad, you can only have 1 scope open at a time, whereas with Lumafusion, you can have 3 scopes open, which I totally prefer because I use different scopes for different things when I'm color correcting. And I've said this before, it drives me crazy that there's not more robust color correction tools in Final Cut Pro for iPad because the iPad is such an excellent color monitor, especially the newest version of the iPad Pro, which has this tandem OLED screen. The picture on this thing is beautiful. This is the perfect device for doing color correcting, but we just don't have the tools in Final Cut Pro for iPad. It's something I've been griping about since it first launched. Now let's talk about effects, titles, and transitions, all the things that spice up your video project. I would say Final Cut Pro and Lumafusion pretty much have the same effects, like distortion tools, chroma keying, masking, pixelation, blurs, drop shadows, and things of that nature. Lumafusion does seem to have a few more, but are they really better? I don't think so. One effect that really does stand out in the Final Cut Pro for iPad app is the scene removal mask. This came with version 1 of Final Cut Pro for iPad, and what it does is it allows you to crop people off a background, no green screen necessary. In terms of transitions, I'd say they're pretty interchangeable. There's some basic wipes and blur transitions, dissolves, nothing really to write home about in either of these apps. But when it comes to titles, Final Cut Pro for iPad 1000% has the advantage. Version 1 of Final Cut Pro for iPad had a lot of different title animations packed into it, and they've even added more in the past year. Whereas with Lumafusion, these titles are terrible. They're static. A lot of them don't work in a vertical aspect ratio. And if you want to add any motion to them at all, you have to use one of these very basic motion effects or keyframe it. There's no doubt that Final Cut Pro for iPad has a huge advantage when it comes to titles, and in my opinion, that's a big deal. One area where Lumafusion, though, does have the edge is when it comes to third-party plugin support, which basically means that you can go out and buy effects and title templates for Lumafusion from a third-party seller and apply them to your video edits. Apple has promised that Final Cut Pro for iPad will have third-party plugin support, and to be honest with you, a year later, I'm kind of shocked we haven't seen that yet. I do know that it's coming down the pike, but hopefully sooner rather than later. Now let's talk about some extras that come with each of these apps. Final Cut Pro comes with a whole bunch of backgrounds, animating objects, and soundtracks, which will retime to the length of your video perfectly. I think this is really cool. And Apple continues to add more of these elements with every update. Lumafusion has Storyblocks integration, which means that you can access some free stock clips, backgrounds, and music cuts from Storyblocks right here in the Lumafusion app. But there's not a ton of free elements. The free ones have these yellow tags on them, so you can see how few there are. And if you want to access all of these stock video and music clips and backgrounds, you need to subscribe to Storyblocks. Which is kind of to be expected. These shots don't just come out of nowhere. Somebody has to go out and capture them. So you should expect to have to pay for them. But I do really like that the integration is right in the Lumafusion app. You don't have to navigate away to a different app or website to access and browse these shots. So I do think that's kind of cool. And then let's talk about some extra bells and whistles. Final Cut Pro has the live drawing feature where you can draw an overlay on top of a video clip with your finger or Apple Pencil, and then it'll animate on over your video. I love this feature. It also has a really cool auto crop feature. So if you have 16:9 video, but you're editing on a vertical timeline, it will use machine learning to detect the subject of your video and auto crop in on it. Big time saver. And one other cool feature that Final Cut Pro for iPad has over Lumafusion is that you can record with your iPad's camera right into the Final Cut app. You don't have to be doing live multicam to do this. You can just do this with one-off camera angles. So which of these apps is the right one for you? I think for a lot of people, it's going to come down to two different things. First of all, device type. You may not have the device you need to run Final Cut Pro for iPad, so you're going to need to be using Lumafusion of these two apps. The other thing to think about is cost. I know a lot of people are turned off by Final Cut Pro for iPad's subscription model, and so for that reason, they prefer Lumafusion. But there is one thing I want to say about the subscription model on Final Cut Pro for iPad. I went back and looked at the version history of these two apps over the past year since I did my last comparison, and Final Cut Pro for iPad has had many, many more updates and improvements than Lumafusion, and not just to catch it up to Lumafusion in terms of functionality, but in the addition of creative assets like title templates, backgrounds, and music tracks that have been added consistently with every update. And I do think this is a testament to the subscription model. The recurring revenue does give developers the ability to continually update and add assets to their apps, whereas Lumafusion has been very stagnant over the past year. So since we made our last comparison, Final Cut Pro for iPad has clearly made huge gains, particularly with the ability to edit from an external drive. Obviously, that's a game changer. I've always personally preferred the UI on Final Cut Pro for iPad. I do wish Apple would add the ability to import your own LUTs, to have third-party plugin support, and to have better color correction tools on Final Cut Pro for iPad. It makes me crazy. And I think both of these apps could use better color correction tools, frankly. But what do you guys think? Which app is the one that you're going to be using? The last time we made this video, there was a lot of discussion in the comments. People felt very strongly between these two apps. So I want to know if your views have changed over the past year. I can't wait to hear from you. In the meantime, here's some other videos I know you guys are going to love. Thanks for hanging out. I'll see you again.